Computer. Okay, everyone. I've got a bit of a treat for you this week. I'm here with the author of this week's reading, one of them anyway, Mark Mordue. Here's his book. You guys have got a chapter, the opening chapter, that you will have read by this stage. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk to Mark about some of the kind of writerly decisions that were made in putting together this chapter and the book more generally. Mark is obviously an exceptional biographer, but he's also a really respected music journalist and poet, and has written a travel journal. What do you call it, Mark? A travel, or how do you describe it?
It's kind of a journal come memoir come reportage collection that weaves together. So yeah, it's like a loose weave memoir, I guess.
Okay. And I see your writing cropping up in other places like Sydney Morning Herald and so on. You're a guy with an opinion that extends beyond the music scene, that's for sure. Anyway, look, this week we're talking about Boy on Fire, and we're thinking about character. And I want to start by saying that when I bought this book, when I first read it, I bought it at the same time that I bought Blake Bailey's biography of Philip Roth. I'm not sure if you've come across that one.
Well, I haven't read it, but I know it, and I know some of the controversy around it.
Yeah. I mean, I got in really when the controversy became apparent, and the publisher was pulling the book from sales and so on. I got in and got a copy quite quickly because I'm a really big Philip Roth fan, and the controversies, I don't really want to comment on those at this stage, but I was more interested in reading about Philip Roth. And I mention this because I'm not such a huge Nick Cave fan, as I was just talking about with Nick, yet I was reading these two books at the same time. And the Nick Cave book was the one that I kept reading, and I still haven't finished the Philip Roth biography. And that told me something that speaks volumes about my admiration for your writing, I suppose, is that you were more captivating to me talking about someone that I don't have a whole lot of love for, I suppose, as opposed to this other guy who was, writing a book that I should have loved. So the big differences, as far as I can tell, are sort of stylistic differences, or at least that's the one I want to talk about. Mm-hmm. The Blake Bailey, Philip Roth book was very dry. It was a presentation of facts. He's done an incredible job of accumulating an enormous amount of facts about Philip Roth's life, but they're all laid down on the page in the driest manner possible. There's very little personality in there, and the personality or persona, there's very little persona in there. And the persona I'm referring to is the persona of the writer, whereas yours has a lot of that. And in fact, there's a quote in the opening chapter that goes something like, biographies are strange beasts underlined by cautionary wisdom that dates back to artists of the Italian Renaissance and their understanding that the portrait painter always paints something of his or herself. So I wondered whether you wouldn't mind speaking to that a little bit, Mark. I suppose speaking about the way in which you navigated that terrain, kind of inserted yourself into this work.
Okay, well, I mean, there's a kind of a few levels to that. The use of first person is only there, I think, in the opening chapter that your students have read and the closing chapter. So that's a kind of a framing. Those are framing chapters, and the presence of me explicitly is noted. But for sure, my presence implicitly is there in descriptive choices, judgments within the writing, a sense of voice, basically, in the main body of the book itself. But I always knew that I didn't want to put too much first person in it, because people were going to be a lot more interested in Nick Cave and than me. At the same time, obviously you've got to tell a story for people who may not be Nick Cave fans, such as yourself, and just to keep people kind of captivated and energized to keep turning the pages and feel involved in something. And I guess too, I think, you know, like a lot of people since pretty much the 60s, like cinema's a pretty big influence. So you tend to write with an eye that's moving, and you tend to unconsciously use close up and, you know, these kind of things. But I mean, the nice thing about writing is you can literally go inside someone through using quotes and conversations and, you know, a little bit of assumption maybe.
As a fiction writer, though, I often think when I'm writing, you know, sort of inventing these characters, not from whole cloth. Usually they are kind of versions of people that I've met in my life or versions of myself. I feel in order to really get into writing a story, there's got to sort of be something at stake for me. I kind of need to feel that I kind of need that Flauberian thing of, you know, it's me on the page. It's not Emma Bovary. I'm dealing with some aspect of myself. She just becomes an avatar through which I look at that. What was at stake for you in taking Nick as a subject? Were you drawn to him because you saw some kind of parallel to yourself there, or?
Well, at first, I always admired Nick as an artist, but I was not a rabid fan, like you see, of which there are many.
Yeah.
But I guess I think this sometimes happens with nonfiction, that you get engaged with a story and you kind of discover a sort of key, like something turns in you, and you kind of find the story in its fullest and deepest way. And I think I mentioned this in that opening section, or maybe it's in the closing part of the book. But I was in Wangaratta, which is where Nick mostly grew up as a young boy, and there was so much familiar to my own boyhood as a kid coming from Newcastle. The sense of suburbia, the park, the swimming pool, the trees, the smell of the season, and I thought, oh my God, like I know this world.
Yeah.
This is, I felt this is my world. It wasn't, but I felt it. And so that was when I knew that the growing up aspect to Nick's story was really important, and I was empathizing with it because of my own kind of growing up experiences, where it feels that you have, I mean, I was about to say come from nowhere, but that's not true. You're actually coming from somewhere really important. You just don't realize till much later how important it is to shaping you, and the kind of rural landscape that Nick arose from, and the sort of a kind of toughness and a kind of dreaming that you can get in the Australian landscape. All these things, you know, I could relate to, and Nick refers to them a lot in songs and refers back to Wangaratta all the time, right to this day. You can hear references to his boyhood and to his youth in Melbourne as well on his latest album, Carnage. And I guess getting older too, we have a kind of a funny mix of yearning and revival that's placed in our childhood and our youth, and things that we didn't even know we had in our memory banks kind of come back to us, and we're trying to figure out who we are, you know, where we kind of went wrong, but also we're trying to restore ourselves with that sort of those memories and strengths of youth as well. So all of that seemed to me to be sort of vital to the book for me to sort of journey through, you know. And I've always been a sucker for growing up stories, for coming of age stories. They've appealed to me a lot, and it's a bit of an obsession of mine, really, you know.
I'm kind of wondering, with a work of this length, you know, a book length work, this is obviously something that takes years to write, and there needs to be a sustained level of interest, and you can call that discipline, or you can call that fanaticism, or you can call it whatever you want. But is that, you talk about this turning moment where you sort of realized, you know, this is my world, I understand it. Is that part of what enabled you to keep going for so long, you know, to not sort of abandon, to not get bored with it after a while, to not sort of get sick of thinking about Nick all the time, that you're always looking for ways in which this material is sort of interesting to you? Is that a driving force, do you think?
Always, you know, like if if you're not engaged with what you're writing, even if it sounds good and there's a degree of superficial craftsmanship, I mean, maybe I'm giving the reader too much credit, but I think people will disengage like you have disengaged. So you have to, it might be to some extent just a mind trick, but I think you have to find ways that keep you involved with the story all the time, you know, like you're always trying to feel a connection, not so that you're drunk with the connection, because you can be over involved and lose sight of things. But I do think the writing process usually will inherently create a degree of detachment, because you're looking at something on a page, you're reorganizing, you're thinking, you can almost go too cold in your judgments, and you're sort of cuts through looking at people and things, and that's a different type of danger from being too idolatrous, I guess. But for sure, I think involvement in the writing is critical, and that thing of the key that we talked about before, me sitting under this tree in Wangaratta, yeah, that was really important to be able to feel for the work, and it kind of kept me believing in the work even when, you know, I hit a whole bunch of problems, because initially it was going to be a complete life of Nick, and I totally lost my way. I got overwhelmed. You know, lots of things went pear-shaped. I was struggling to make a living, keep my own personal life in order. But I never lost belief in my feeling for the work. And the other thing is, which is helpful, Nick's a really interesting artist with a vast sort of catalogue of his own work, and his work references so many other things, you know, relation to Boy on Fire, whether Nick is sort of nodding his head towards a Brisbane sort of great sort of punk band like the Saints, or he's beginning to be influenced by Flannery O'Connor's writing, or he's interested in certain sort of elements of the Dadaists and the Surrealists. And then you bring all these other interesting characters in, like a Roland S. Howard, or a collaborator like Mick Harvey, and he's Nick's own background as an art school student and a painter, and the paintings that he liked. I mean, that was perpetually interesting to me, and like kind of leaping into a sort of informal university, because I'm chasing up those influences. Some of them I knew very intimately myself. That was sort of helpful as well, because I'm just a year or two younger than Nick.
Yeah.
And so the cultural influences of the Whitlam era historically, of growing up in Australia at the same time in a different but in some ways similar place, it felt like I was in a sort of parallel narrative experience of growing up. And I knew a lot of this stuff. I'd been through the same things. So, you know, the combination of familiarity and also just being able to sort of dive into the other figures around Nick and all those influences, you know, kept it interesting. And it still is interesting to me, because it seems to always traverse, Nick's connection in Wangaratta to the whole Ned Kelly mythology, which is central to that sort of district. I mean, that's really interesting, you know, the Crystal Ballroom scene in Melbourne, and all the, artists, musicians, painters, drug addicts, whatever, who were part of that world in the 70s. That's really interesting. So it's not as if all I'm doing is looking at Nick. I'm looking at myself. I'm looking at history. I'm looking at culture and watching it change. Great opportunity.
Talking about this sort of constellation of figures, or these characters surrounding Nick's world, I wonder if you'd speak briefly about the process of taking a real life figure and essentially turning them into a literary character, right? Like, you're making certain decisions along the way about how you're going to render Nick, and you've got to pay deference to certain narrative demands about your character having an arc and changing and all of these kinds of things. And you've got a limited number of words that you can use, so you clearly can't present a human being in all of their entirety and complexity. And I guess, look, the way this subject works is the students will read your work and then they're going to read a fiction work at the same time. And I'm asking them to think about the way in which fictional and non-fictional writers attend to those kinds of concerns, the construction of character. Can you talk a little bit about the process of constructing a character who is also a real life human being?
Okay, well, I mean, obviously, if you're in non-fiction, there are kind of all kinds of constraints and limits on you, like the facts of the story. At the same time, non-fiction allows you a lot of license that would seem unbelievable in fiction, in terms of strange coincidences and sort of foretellings of fate that an editor looking at a fiction book might go, well, that's a little bit forced here.
Yeah.
Or it's like, well, no, actually that happened, you know. And you know, I'm probably lucky with Nick in that he has already been mythologizing himself, you know, almost from the outset, and attaching himself to all kinds of mythical figures, be it Ned Kelly or Kafka's characters, and the Metamorphosis, that sort of tale, so Nick is to Milton's Paradise Lost. Nick has always been attaching his life story to larger than life tales from literature and the Bible, so that kind of gave me a lot of room to move.
Did you not feel, though, that part of your job was to cut through some of that self mythologizing and to find, you know, such a bad phrase, but to find the real angle? Like, clearly Nick's making kind of decisions about the way in which he wants to present himself as an artist, the way he's hoping to be seen, and your job is not so much to promulgate those mythologies, but to cross-check them in some instances, right? And to like, again, that bad phrase of real, but to find the real Nick that's lurking beneath all that self-mythologizing.
Well, that's true. I mean, I'm not sure that any of us have a singular real.
No, it's a bad turn of phrase.
But I know what you're talking about, and for sure, I never was. I mean, I know that Nick likes the book because he messaged me about it, and we went through some kind of difficult territory with it, partly because I was just taking so long, partly because, you know, he lost his son in a terrible sort of accident, and you know, so, and the nature of the book changed over time too, in terms of its scope, and I zeroed in on Nick's youth more and more. But I was not writing to sort of please Nick or to just like, I've seen a lot of that there is this sort of, particularly around Nick as an artist, that writers in journalism, as well as in biography, but particularly journalists and stories, they sort of fall into Nick and his mythology sort of swamps what they write. So I was always, again, that thing of wanting a degree of coolness, and to sort of try to maintain a sort of a lower temperature in how I wrote about him, but also with humour and with energy nonetheless.
Do you have a sort of personal code of ethics that helps you navigate that? I mean, if you're working as a journalist, you're sort of bound by professional codes of ethics, but you're in a bit more of a grey area. Like, let's say you run into a situation where you want to say something that, you know, your subject matter, in this case Nick, isn't going to be too pleased with, or he's decided at the last minute that he doesn't want you to publish the book after all, as I believe was, you know, the case for a while there. And you've had to make some decisions there, you know, on your own, which presumably you do have this kind of internal set of ethics or guidelines. How do you go about establishing that? Is that something you
well, with
figure out along the way?
yeah, you figure it out on the way. It's sometimes with difficulty. I always told Nick that the minute that I was in his company, that was all on, that I was working.
Yeah.
I mean, but, this is a project that did drag on for years, and it still gets pretty ambiguous, and people forget, and I forget, you get to be, I mean, like I got to know Nick pretty good. It becomes like a working friendship, like we could have, I use this comparison, it's a bit of a crass one, but if Nick and I had been working at McDonald's for 6 years, like it's a working friendship, and you just, all this stuff comes out. But the connection is only there while you're working together, and then when the work stops, the relationship tends to sort of
Right.
diverge,
Yeah.
But so yeah, I think, I mean, when you're writing, you start to meet those things a bit more head on. Like one of the kind of ethical difficulties I had was not so much with Nick, who is such a big public figure and who I feel is very, very experienced and pretty able to sort of manage his image and affairs with people.
Yeah.
But more the problem of collateral damage. So people who are not public figures but friends with Nick, or who had previously been involved with Nick in the book. And there's one or two that I still feel uneasy about in the book, where I could have hurt their feelings or have misrepresented them. And a part of that is just by just getting something wrong.
Yeah.
And the other part of it is that with minor characters in terms of the book, you might basically be summing real life people up in a couple of sentences or one scene. And they would look at aghast at it and think, well, that's not me, or the weight of that impact is confronting. So that's where I think it becomes more difficult, all these other characters, because I think over the book there's Nick, I think it's maybe around 30 main people, like there is, without kind of wanting to exaggerate my own abilities, like Dostoevsky level, there's a lot of subsidiary characters there, and you're in the double bind because you want people to remember a character, that a kid that they met on page 40 who comes up on page 210. So you want the description to be strong, to be memorable, to be potent, to stay in the mind. And that emphatic energy in the writing can also make this real person, who is not just a character in a book, feel a bit hurt or like summed up. So those kind of things are, I think, ethically, the balance between the ethical and the creative in that sense is difficult. And you're really trying to get the points and counterpoints in a fair enough balance to hopefully make people happy, and still you've got to be trying to tell the truth as best one can manage it.
There's a section in the book in which you deal with Nick's father and his death, and there's some sort of obviously speculative writing going on there. You're creating a scene which you didn't, have first-hand access to, and in fact, you don't even have the figure who was there to be able to tell you the way things were. So in that section, you've sort of, it strikes me that you've got this skeleton of bare facts, and that you need to flesh out. You need to become an artist, and you need to turn it into something. You need to make narrative happen on the page. So you're needing to. That's sections like that where you, to my reading anyway, where you're most clearly straddling the line between fiction and non-fiction. And I'm not somebody that writes an enormous amount of non-fiction at all. So it's something that I'm really interested in. I can't advise students firsthand on how to navigate that terrain, but I'm interested in hearing how you go about, writing a scene like that, where you go, well, I'm going to have to make up a lot of stuff here. But it's a truthful portrait, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, look, that's the chapter on early on, depicting Nick Cave's father returning from a sort of drama performance camp outside of Wangaratta, and effectively it tells from the perspective of Nick Cave's father the accident that kills him. Yeah, I mean, it's not entirely like that, but that's a simple summary. To do that, I spoke to Nick about what happened. I spoke to Nick's mother, Dawn Cave, about what happened. I spoke to friends of Nick at the time who were around Nick and the trauma and the drama of it and the bits they knew. I travelled to Wangaratta and spoke to peers of Nick Cave's father, Colin Cave, who worked with Colin Cave at the Wangaratta Centre for Adult Education and at the school. I interviewed, I've forgotten his first name, Adrian Twitt, who was a colleague of Colin Cave's and taught with him and who went to identify the body. I also got the police reports, including photographs and the full details of the accident, cause of death, the police reports on the scene and interviews with people who were witness to the accident from a distance. They only saw a cloud of dust and came to the car and found it, and found Colin Cave dead. And partly just as a matter of coincidence, I drove that road where Colin Cave had his accident, and it was almost exactly the same time of year and same hour of day. And I got all the details from the police reports and my interviews, and I drove to as near as I could find it, the spot where the accident occurred, right? So there was a huge amount of detail and research and interviewing and first-hand reporting that went into writing that. I didn't just invent it. Yeah. I mean, I'd certainly, there's creative license in the perspective, but it hasn't sort of, I think that it's pushing the envelope of the line between non-fiction and fiction, but as near as one can keep it over on the non-fiction line, it's using fictional techniques with respect to the best reporting and research skills I can bring to it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Mark. Look, maybe I'll just wrap up with a sort of final question, which is I suppose a bit of a craft-based question that hopefully benefits these students who might want to go out and write biographies themselves at some point. There's a section, again, early on in the chapter that the students have read, in which you say, I felt I had somehow failed. This was largely because I didn't really understand how to write this up. You're referring to just having met Nick for the first time.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that even just listening to you talk about the amount of research and field work involved in putting together that chapter about Nick's dad, that you must have had an enormous amount of, a large number of notebooks filled with details.
Crazy amounts.
How do you not get subsumed by all of this info? How do you handle that process of turning it into something that is 300 odd pages long and has shape and structure and isn't just chaotic?
Well, that mention in the story, I was a young writer then, and Nick was completely off his head, and I was in my 20s, and I would often let stories just fall away, like just doing the transcript was too much bother, can't be stuffed, and
right.
It's 3 months drags on, it's yesterday's, so it's just lazy, undisciplined. The conversation we had before about the chapter on Nick's father, that was an exceptional amount of research. But the subject was very serious and profoundly important to Nick. So I wasn't about to make the presumptions I made without putting myself in a very, very strong place, or I wouldn't be able to do it and do it well. Overall, yeah, I had a ton of research. I interviewed way too many people, and I was kind of a bit unfocused about my interviewing as well. I'd interview pretty obscure people, and other people turn you down that are really important that you want to speak to. That can make things difficult too. But it crush me. I had too much, and I just lost my ability to progress, and the book sort of collapsed about midway, and it took me a couple of years to get it back on track. And that is why the book is really, in the end, Boy on Fire. It's a growing up story, because I had to somehow confine the frame of the book, because it just kept growing and growing and growing, and I'd lost any ability to growing in time. But also, like, if you've ever seen that film City of God, every sort of incident or room was like a rabbit hole, and there'd be all this, or song, and you go down, down, down into influences, events, and I was disappearing into the depths of it, as well as the sort of kind of horizontal trajectory. So I just,
I mean, some of that you've already spoken about is what made it interesting to you, those unforeseen trajectories and discovering things that are interesting to Nick and so on. I guess, I'm wary of these bits of it. On one level, I really like when you read these interviews with writers and they give some really simple piece of advice. This is how you're able to go, of course, it's so simple. And then you go away and try to put it in practice, and it doesn't work. It's just makes for good reading, perhaps, or reassuring reading as a writer. But is there something that, if you were to take on this project again, how would you approach it differently to try to avoid some of those writerly pitfalls?
I'd have my I did have a pretty organized timeline happening in terms of mapping it, but I'd be even more disciplined about that. I'd probably be even more. I mean, big books, you need to sort of plan and structure, and I've always been more of a writer that finds the structure through the writing, and that's pretty much the hard way to go. And I made a lot of unnecessary work for myself. So some sort of planning formation. Like, I did have a sort of structure for the book that I've mostly still stuck to, despite the fact that it fell apart for a while. I mean, it's fairly conventional, really. There's the framing device, which is a sort of present day, and then essentially you've got a kind of galvanizing incident, a kind of two flashbacks, and then you're into that two galvanizing incidents, two flashbacks, and then you're into the body of the story, just A to Z. It's very straightforward time-wise. And so I knew that place would help me structure things. So Wangaratta, Melbourne, and with that, the people and influences of those areas. And I was interested in a more symbolic understructure, which sounds pretentious, but relates to Milton's Paradise Lost that Nick's referred to in loads of songs. And, basically the biblical story of the father, the father God casts Satan out of heaven. Nick's dad sort of banishes Nick to Melbourne to go to boarding school. There are all these sort of quasi-biblical parallels, but people didn't need to see or know that. That just helped me. I think I'm not articulating very well, but you need a chronological structure. You need a sort of geographic structure, like very basic pegs. And then you need a sort of symbolic structure, which is a little bit more sort of hidden, and probably more the way a poet might think about building a poem, where they begin to see how certain images or things can hold a poem together as much as its content or semi-linear structure. So that symbolic understructure was as important to me as an invisible shaping device, and it helped me again feel that the work had a sort of essence to it for me, kind of that was invisible but sort of pulsing and alive.
Yeah, that seems to correspond with your your kind of instinct towards finding a way or finding the structure as you go, because a lot of those images and things that form nice little connections are sort of accidental. You know, at least when I'm writing anyway, I find that to be the case, that you don't realize that you've got this same kind of motif occurring over and over. But once you do, then you start deliberately playing with that and seeing what that can do to inform meaning and the rest of it.
There is a difference though with non-fiction in that I think particularly if you experienced as a journalist, like I've been doing interviews and profiles for 40 years, there are moments in an interview where you kind of hear the story, there's something that someone says, or you'll see something like a gesture, or
that's very interesting. Yeah,
there might be even just the color of a cup that they drink from that makes you think about a lyric in a song, that makes you think about something they've said in the interview. And those three kind of collisions are enough to sort of create a sort of a symbolic holding structure for you. And then you might sort of just begin in the same way. So you sort of begin in a very present day moment, you flash back over the narrative of the person's history, you're interspersing quotes, but within that, you know, these key elements have a sort of resonance, and where you place them is going to be important to the structural coherence of the story and to its sort of emotional power, particularly obviously where you start and where you end, where you want to end in a way that leaves things open and keeps people thinking about the story.
I have no idea though.
Does that for you if you're tuned?
I don't know how you would do those things though with that really planned approach. And to me, maybe that's a little bit of the difference between what's going on in your book. There are these resonances that have this poetic, artistic kind of tenor to them, which were lacking in the Philip Roth biography, which I felt was just a big dump of facts on the page. And I wasn't, it didn't feel like I was engaging with a piece of art, which is what feels like when I'm reading this. This feels like literature. The other thing feels like, you know, an encyclopedia entry. And I just don't know. I'm really hopeless at organizing things in advance as well. And anytime I've tried to make a plan, it's out the window within about a paragraph.
Yeah.
I'll write something in this paragraph that, you know, this sort of generative image or line crops up that I want to follow into the next paragraph. And it seems to develop that way. And on the one hand, I'm envious of these people that can really, really lay out a strict plan and stick to it.
Well, it's never like that. It's not like it's not such an uptight plan for me, but you still have administrative requirements. Like people have to, like I said, remember someone who's key to the story in the early and later stages.
Yeah.
Managing just dates and times. I mean, that is a bit of a headache with nonfiction, you know, like the dates and times do become important, and even repetitions of names of real people that are a nuisance. Like I've got Nick Harvey, I've got Polly Jean Harvey, a great love interest. I've got Father PJ Harvey. It's like, does everybody in Nick's life have to have their last name Harvey? That's a real. It's just such a nuisance.
Yeah, if you're writing fiction, you would change them so people didn't use them. Yeah.
Of course, just to make life easy on yourself, but you can't do that, you know. So you have to. So managing information, and you know, there was maybe a couple of moments where I still worry that people might have got a bit lost in time frame, particularly the opening section on Nick's drive to the ARIA Awards, where he's reflecting back on his life. So, you know, I mean, it's a challenge, but you're always. I mean, I'm sure it's true for you with fiction as well. It's a bit of a kind of constant sort of tense trade-off between elements of planning and just that free form exploration. And then, of course, I mean, you're writing, so you're going to rewrite, you'll go back and introduce stronger structural forms. But in a big book like this, you've got to have a few basic plans worked out. And some of it's just simply organization in terms of approaching it, like who are you going to interview, what albums appeared when, the key figures, as I say, and a bit of a sort of enough familiarity to have an idea of what the important themes are likely to be. But you don't want to be a prisoner to your preparation. You know, like you have to be willing to shift. So when you use a phrase before like angle, and I've certainly seen this in journalism, certain editors and certain journalists will stay to the angle no matter what, whether it's even true. Yeah, that they've found they've decided on what the spine of the thing is. And you particularly see it, I think, in tabloid journalism, but that they will adhere to that, whether it's correct or not, because that is the easy, consumable story that you can kind of dump and put out there. But of course, if you truly care about your work and what you're doing, and you really respect what we call the truth, then you're trying to sort of evolve and loosen those shapes, and you might be required to completely do a U-turn and say something else, and then you get into the problem-solving element of nonfiction, where you're trying to work out, well, what do I do now? What I thought I was going to say has been completely upended.
Right. That might be a good place to end. That's fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing all that. Let me find the stop button here.